Every year we at BSP hold a public lecture series. These lectures are intended to bring leading thinkers and practitioners on topics related to planning and the built environments before an audience of colleagues, students and guests. We've heard already in this series from Professors Carol Williams and Julie Froud on the foundational economy. And next month we will welcome Professor Andy Pike from Newcastle University, who will speak on is fixing infrastructure in the London Global City region undermining the rest of the UK. I think we all know the answer to that here. In June, our series concludes with our annual Sir Peter Hall lecture, named for our late and esteemed colleague. This year, the lecture will be given by the Right Honourable Lord Kerslake, Chair of the UK 2070 Commission on Regional Inequalities, in which the Bartlett School of Planning is an active participant. Please look at our website for details of the programme and come to future events. It's our custom on these occasions to offer you hospitality, which will be available in the south cloister of the Wilkins building once our proceedings are concluded. If you don't know where that is, follow the crowd. Please do join us. Let me now introduce this evening's speaker, Professor Lynne Sagalyn. Professor Sagalyn is the Earl W. Carzes and Benjamin Shaw Professor Emerita of Real Estate in the Division of Finance and Economics at Columbia Business School, where she's held the positions of Director of the Paul Milstein Centre for Real Estate and Director of the MBA Real Estate Programme. Professor Sagalyn is an expert in real estate equity securities, public-private development and finance, economic development and urban policy. And she's published extensively on a broad range of issues in the fields of real estate, investment, public-private finance and urban policy. And she's known for her research in particular on public-private finance, public-private partnerships and city building. She's the author of Times Square Roulette, Remaking the City Icon, which was published by MIT Press in 2001, which was an analysis of the politics, policy and economics of one of New York's largest and longest redevelopment initiatives. She's the author also of Cases in Real Estate, Finance and Investment Strategy, published by the Lincoln Institute, and co-author of Downtown Inc., How America Rebuilds Cities, also published by MIT Press, as well as numerous articles for academic and professional qualifications. She received her PhD from MIT in 1980, her Master's in City and Regional Planning from Rutgers in 1971, and graduated from Cornell in 1969. Prior to her appointment at Columbia Business School, she was on the faculty of the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at MIT. We've invited Professor Sagalyn this evening to speak about her most recent book, Power at Ground Zero, Politics, Money and the Remaking of Lower Manhattan, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2016. As we know, the destruction of the World Trade Center complex in 2001 had massive global geopolitical consequences. But the symbolic locus of the post-9/11 world has always been Ground Zero, the 16 acres in Manhattan's financial district where the Twin Towers collapsed. The book shows that while idealism dominated the initial rebuilding phase, thereafter interest group conflict ensued. The book charts the conflicts between the real estate interests, victims' families, politicians, the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, the federal government, community groups, architectural firms, and a range of ambitious private developers that raged for over a decade. Edward Glaser, writing in the New York Times, described the book as the authoritative history of this mega project on America's most hallowed building site, while the Los Angeles Review of Books describes how the author navigates through the thicket of conflicting visions, competing interests, and shifting alliances to deliver an authoritative account of the saga. So this is a story we're very much looking forward to hearing about. And therefore, without further ado, let me say, Professor Sagalyn, welcome to London, welcome to UCL. Welcome to the Bartlett School of Planning, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, for such a lovely introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here. The opportunity, I'd always known about Bartlett, but this is the first time I'd gotten an invitation, so it's very special for me to fly across the pond and to really share this story with you. As John said, 9/11 was kind of a worldwide searing event, but it hit New York viscerally and physically, obviously. And as a result, the research and writing of this book was different from anything I had ever done before, although I had written complex books and complex articles. I kind of think the Times Square book got me warmed up for this project, but I don't think there's anything that could have prepared me for writing this. And so I want to just spend a few words about what it took to write this and why it was a little different. It took me 12 years. Now I was doing a bunch of other things like many of the other professors in here, teaching and dealing with students. But first of all, I was writing about current history. And the story would only unfold as the current history unfolded over time as it evolved. And initially, I was naive. My goal was to write a series of essays on the stages of redevelopment. And I'd written the first essay on the politics of planning the site, and that was in 2004. And I was working on the second essay in 2007, and I said, I can't do this in essays. It's really a book. And so then I kind of had to start all over again on some of the research. And it became a book because the story was so complex. And I conducted somewhere on the order of 180 interviews and conversations with people starting in 2003. And it was very emotional for me and for many of the people I interviewed. And at the end of the interview, many would say, well, thank you for doing this. And that also became a theme, that for me personally, the work was different because I was writing a history that was important to the city that I was born in, the city that I had worked most of my professional life in. And I wanted the story to stand as a chronicle for urban planners and policy people and deputy mayors, the people who actually have a hand in making the decisions that shape cities. And I wanted to write the story in such a way that a broad audience could understand what it takes for a city that is ambitious and generally undaunted by anything to recover from what is essentially a traumatic event. And anybody who was in New York City, in particular Manhattan, on 9/11 will never forget exactly where they were. It's just the same as any memories that you might have on something traumatic. Everybody knows where they were. And we all know in the States, my generation, where we were when John F. Kennedy was assassinated, you know. And so these kind of events really have an enormous power on one's life. Finding a narrative line to explain this complex story only came about after a lot of rooting about for meaning. What did it mean to me? This was unlike any other city rebuilding project. And I needed to find a way to simplify the complexity of the story, but not lose the nuance of the detail that would lend credibility to the statements I would be making. And also, I wanted people to understand how cities get rebuilt, which is what I've written about most of my life. Unraveling this story was probably the most difficult project I undertook in my professional life. And yet I took heart from a comment that Robert Caro made when he was halfway through The Power Broker, when he realized that he didn't have the right storyline. and that he had to start all over again. And that was rather comforting to hear that from somebody like Caro. But I will say that my editor at Oxford Press, who I adore, was unbelievably helpful, as editors are. I never realized just how critical editors are until I got there. And he just helped me thread through the complexity. Rebuilding the site of the destroyed World Trade Center, and that's what it looked like before, and that's shortly thereafter, that's September 17th, was not just a New York project, not just a New York story. How these 16 acres were rebuilt held meaning beyond the physical precinct of Lower Manhattan, because the symbolism, as John mentioned, of 9/11, it was an attack on the icon of capitalism. So it was an attack in New York City on Western ideas of civilization, on Western views of economic and social life. So what did I want to just sort of give you a synopsis of what I concluded, and then I want to detail a couple of stories to explain how it was so difficult to reconcile how the site was going to be rebuilt. First of all, the rebuilding of Ground Zero is a story of power politics among contending government forces and private real estate interests. It's not a story about design or architectural features or architectural battles, though this was a very much consuming part of the media portrayal of rebuilding in the first, really, 5 years. Second, it's really a story of ambition. And I know that sort of sounds odd when you're talking about a traumatic event where almost 3,000 people lost their lives. But all the players in this theater of rebuilding harbored ambition, both personal and professional. And as constructive as ambition can be in the kind of societies that we live in this case, ambition rather quickly eroded the kind of civic consensus and civic cooperation that prevailed in the first 6 months. That was the dark side of ambition. Third, this is a story about the politics of reconciling aspiration with economic reality. For many years, there were no budgets about how this site was going to be rebuilt. I mean, it was almost hearsay to talk about money, what it was going to cost to rebuild. So ultimately, you have to deal with that economic reality of what it's going to cost to rebuild a site that had been totally destroyed. So part of the story is how the aspirations for rebuilding were reconciled with the economic reality. In part, it was conflict because the politicians would not or could not set priorities among the different goals of rebuilding, and I will explain. Fourth, this is not a story about heroes and villains. You know, whenever you write a book that you want to attract a broad audience for, you know, the publishers will tell you it's great if you have a villain or if you have a hero. This is about institutions as well as people, and they don't make for such great, media. The Port Authority of New York, New Jersey does have a profile that tends to raise everybody's interest. But it's about the clashes and the egos and the personalities of the players and how they shaped and how those personalities shaped what we see on the site today. And finally, I think the story illuminates the role of symbolic politics. So often, modern city building is dismissed as cold-hearted and detached from meaning. But at Ground Zero, everything had meaning. This is a long book, and I'm always pleased when somebody manages to get through all 700 pages before the documentation, and I worked really hard to make it interesting, to make it an interesting read. The story is clearly too big to tell in 45 minutes, but I want to highlight one particular aspect of the story which I think will be most illuminating to planners and policy people in this audience, and that is how rebuilding's twin mandates. There were two mandates in rebuilding. One was to remember the 3,000 people who lost their lives, who really were murdered on September 11th. And then the second mandate was to rebuild the site with ambition and purpose to assure New York's prominence as a global city. I mean, we're always still competing with London, mostly London as a global city, and what the politicians in power then, both the Governor George Pataki, the outgoing Mayor Rudy Giuliani, and the incoming Mayor Michael Bloomberg were all concerned about was to rebuild the economic powerhouse in Lower Manhattan. And it wasn't sufficient just to do one or the other. You had to rebuild both. You had to remember and rebuild. And that dual mandate had real implications for rebuilding the site. What you had, and I like to use editorial cartoons because I think they capture feelings in a way that few other kinds of images do. This was the problem. You had to rebuild as a redevelopment project, but you also had the families of the victims who wanted the site. Really, many of the families wanted all 16 acres to be a memorial, and that was not acceptable to the powers that be, nor to most New Yorkers. We are a commercial city. But the emotional claim of remembrance was the unquestionable priority. But it was in constant tension with the strategic significance of rebuilding the city economy through a massive redevelopment project. This site, the World Trade Center site, if I go back here, these buildings were built in the 60s, and they were built as an economic development project to help revitalize Lower Manhattan. So 40 years later, after 9/11, the city is still trying to revitalize Lower Manhattan, which is the historic center city. The confusion and this redevelopment project, which is probably why I was invited, attracted worldwide attention. And the newspapers were full of constant media attention to the project. But this was really an encumbered site. This site was not carte blanche for rebuilding. It was encumbered in many different ways. One, the attack on 9/11 transformed the 16 acres into hallowed ground. This is the original site plan where you had this big plaza and 4 buildings. And the image to the left of it, these concentric circles show the radii of destruction. The extent of physical damage was enormous, but it was measurable, and it could be replaced. The buildings could all be replaced. The terrorist murderous attack, however, created an emotional trauma for the city and certainly the families that was beyond measurement. And it encumbered the site in a unique way. This is what we all remember in Manhattan of 9/11. The firefighters, and there were so many who lost their lives, the people running for their lives, and the confusion on the site as all the first responders tried to look for survivors. I remember I was at the business school in the morning, and I was in my office early, and after the first tower fell, my colleague came to my office and she said, "Lynne, you'll never believe what happened." And we went down to the lobby where there were televisions in the lobby. And we, as a business school, had students, former students, who would have been working at Lower Manhattan. And I said, well, let's try to line up everybody who's here and see if we're going to be in an orderly fashion so we could give blood. Of course, it never dawned on us that there would be basically no need for blood because very few people were surviving. This kind of emotional trauma, it was like this enormous cloud on everybody. So government officials who were responsible for managing the process of rebuilding had to do this within the context of trauma in a city that was reeling emotionally and economically and psychologically from the attack. The sacred nature of the site created a supercharged dimension to the politics of planning because it defined the families as a political constituency. Okay? And as time would tell, no politician could say no to what the families wanted. I would ask every player, and the answer was always the same. Nobody could say no. Mayor Bloomberg tried to say no on one occasion and quickly had to back down. So this created a situation unlike any other planning situation. Second, the mandate to both rebuild and remember defined an unprecedented public interest. The public interest with this is a picture of the families of the victims on the ramp on the first anniversary of 9/11. I will talk about that wall shortly. Those mandates created an unprecedented, emotional, compelling public interest, okay? And this public interest was sort of semi-hidden, and it was semi-hidden because the public interest challenge commanded priority over prevailing property rights. We both live in societies where private property rights are paramount. Okay. This is the property rights that were now called into question in terms of their priority were the property rights of the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, which owned the land, which it had just sold the leasehold to Larry Silverstein, and he's holding the keys to the 4 buildings and the commercial center, part of it. This is Governor Pataki, and they're all celebrating this privatization of the Port Authority's cash cow. This is 6 weeks before 9/11. So 9/11, all of a sudden, you had these property rights challenged by the precedence, the priority of the public interest of rebuilding the site as a memorial. Okay. Normally, these contractual property rights based upon ownership and management of the buildings would have to be amended. There was no way the original lease agreement between the Port Authority and Larry Silverstein, which was for existing buildings to be managed over 99 years, there was no way that agreement could be a foundation, a legal or moral or social foundation for rebuilding a site that everything had been destroyed. Legally, it was just not the right contract. It was dysfunctional. In a conventional situation, the rights of property would be discussed and debated as part of a planning or regulatory process. But because the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey owned the site, planning of the Trade Center was exempt from that type of systematic process. The reason it was exempt is because the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, which in itself is an unusual bi-state entity, is exempt from city laws or regulations. It has its own, it's an entity within its own, which defines its own rules and regulations. So, Governor Pataki set up an organization, an entity called the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, to manage rebuilding, but it was no substitute for the kind of systematic, deliberate process. And the process that evolved over time was very messy and chaotic. Now, I want to explain. That is Governor Pataki, and you notice that he is larger than anybody else in this cartoon, and that's because he really has most, not all, most of the reins of power. To his left, this is Mayor Bloomberg, and this little guy here is Joe Seymour, who is the executive director of the Port Authority. And they're just watching everybody fight it out. And that's pretty much what happened for several years. And Governor Pataki would, kind of fly in and resolve an issue every once in a while. But it was very chaotic. The third encumbrance of the site was that the stakes of rebuilding were obviously huge. This is an image of the site when recovery was complete in March 2002. The world was watching what New York was doing, and most of the nation was watching what New York was doing because rebuilding was really fraught with strategic significance. Odd as it might sound, the destruction of this massive complex created an unusual and unique opportunity for the city to rethink what it needed for the long term on this site and how it would impact the economy of Lower Manhattan. Soon after the attack, President George H. Bush promised the city $20 billion, which in today's world doesn't sound like a lot, but 20 years ago it was a lot of money, in federal funds for recovering and rebuilding. And with that pledge, city officials felt they could think big and they could be very ambitious. And it was a very, it was an unusual opportunity. The federal government doesn't go around handing out money. And it was actually a huge fight. It's one thing to promise money, but the money actually comes through appropriation of Congress. And New York has never been a favorite of Congress. I mean, we're just lambasted for everything. And it was a real fight to make sure that the city got that money appropriated soon, because if they didn't get the money soon, there would always be some other calamity that would happen that would call for it. And sure enough, you had Katrina. The Katrina hit New Orleans 5 years or so later. But it took about 2 years for New York to get the money. So let me talk about the twin mandates. So you have a sense from those comments that how fraught and how encumbered this site was, both physically and symbolically. One of the ways I want to explain what you'll see on the site when you go there is to talk about how these twin mandates were accommodated in the rebuilding process. First of all, as I said, the first, I'm going to go through 3 different cases to show how this tension between rebuilding and remembrance played out in the decisions that were made on what to rebuild and how to rebuild. The first example it focuses on preserving the footprints of the Twin Towers. And that's why this cartoon is so powerful, because there was a whole fight over the footprints of where the towers were. And in June 2002, Governor Pataki declared that nothing would be built on the footprints. Although a statement was unexpected, many believed that the footprints could never be built on because of their symbolic, not only their symbolic value, but they were a grave site, because to this day, something like almost 50% of the remains have never been found. And so that the families didn't want anything built on the footprints, because for them, that was the graveyard. So this commitment that Pataki made, that nothing would be built on the footprints, immediately set aside 8 of the 16 acres that could not be built on. effectively establishing a memorial quadrant. Okay? Here are the two footprints, and basically nothing would end up being built here. Now, the reason this became a quadrant is these two dotted lines represent the reintegration of two cross streets into the grid of Lower Manhattan. This was the only point of consensus in the 16 years of the rebuilding of this project, because the original site was a superblock, and it was elevated way above the existing fabric on either ends of the superblock. And nobody wanted that condition to remain, as a tremendous grade change going both ways. So in order to accommodate the rebuilding aspect, you had to fit 10 million square feet of office space on that L-shaped portions remaining of the site. That was actually almost impossible without crowding the site so much that the density would have been unacceptable. And even Larry Silverstein, after many, many months of negotiations, agreed that there was no way you could fit the 10 million square feet of office space that had been lost on the site on only 8 acres. Okay? So how did they resolve this tension? They resolved this tension by expanding the site. This is the original site, and I'll talk about this diagram later. And they expanded it by acquiring 2 blocks south of the site. And the reason this was such a solution was that it was a politically expedient solution. They didn't have to make choices among priorities. They didn't have to say, well, we can't really have as much of the site dedicated to the memorial. They just expanded it to accommodate the rebuilding portion. So it made everybody, it satisfied everybody. It accommodated the needs of the Port Authority, which had to rebuild its money-making machine. The World Trade Center was one of the big revenue sources for the Port Authority. It accommodated the families, which got this enormous quadrant of remembrance. And it accommodated Larry Silverstein and his investors, who would be assured that they would be able to replace the 10 million square feet of office space which they had purchased just 6 weeks earlier. So, and the fact that politicians didn't have to make a choice of one or the other was critical. And so this was the first instance of how that tension between rebuilding and remembrance was accommodated, by finding a solution that could accommodate both without having to make difficult choices between them. So the second example. This, by the way, is what's called the dimension site plan of what would be rebuilt. You had the 2 footprints. There would be a museum complex here, and then you would have 1 tower, 2 towers, 3 tower, 4 tower, and the 5th tower. And you would have a transportation terminal, which was really the Port Authority's own memorial to its fallen people. And someday we might see the Performing Arts Center. I think it might actually happen. It's been an orphan of the project, because this was a memorial to those who passed and lost their lives. Culture was intended in the master plan to be the living memorial, as often culture is viewed. Okay, so that's the first example of how it was accommodated. The second example, it has to do with the memorial design itself. After a fairly contentious process, the master plan vision created by Studio Daniel Libeskind was chosen in February 2003. The plan included preserving the slurry wall. This slurry wall became the touchstone, symbolic touchstone of the site after 9/11. The slurry wall, the Hudson River used to come up to Greenwich Street. Greenwich Street at one point had been the western boundary of Lower Manhattan. When the World Trade Center was built, they had to create a slurry wall to prevent the waters of the Hudson from coming into the site. And so the mass of these two buildings was part of the way the slurry wall stayed in place. I'm not an architect or an engineer, so I use very simple language on things like this. 9/11, this remained in place, miraculously, by most accounts, and it became a touchstone of survival. So the Libeskind Master Plan emphasized this slurry wall in its designation of the memorial site, okay? Many people took exception to this because they felt that the master plan actually designed the memorial by depressing it 30 feet down, okay? The site actually goes to bedrock is 70 feet down. The selection of what actually would be built as the memorial was a separate process that came after the selection of the master plan. It was governed by an independent jury, which had other ideas about the appropriateness of depressing a memorial 30 feet below grade. Okay? And those that submitted memorial designs were told by the LMDC that they could ignore the guidelines of the memorial design brief. I mean, it was explicit, okay? And they all did. The 6 finalist designs all ignored the design guidelines of the master plan. Again, the consensus here was this would separate the site from the fabric of Lower Manhattan, which was the only point of consensus in the planning for rebuilding. So, the chosen design by Michael Arad and Peter Walker brought it up to grade, had lots of changes to the memorial, but this was the massing of the impact, and this is what it looks like today. And it is very much integrated into the fabric of Manhattan. So the goal here was just to, again, these were goals of equal importance, but there was clearly an unquestioned priority to remembrance. And once that independent jury was selected, they were going to choose whatever design that they wanted. A third example, really in many ways the most dramatic one, has to do with the preservation of these staircases, called the Vesey staircases. Okay? There's a whole question of what are you going to preserve from this site? What historic artifacts are you going to preserve in the rebuilding process? In 2004, officials of the National Park Service determined that the site was eligible for inclusion in the National Register of Historic Places because of, quote unquote, its exceptional importance in the history of the nation, even though its age was less than 50 years. And that's the benchmark, the minimal benchmark for the American National Register. For hundreds of workers who managed to escape, they came down one of these 2 staircases. Because remember, I told you the original site was elevated above grade in its own platform, in its own world up there. For them, the Vesey staircase was a cherished symbol, even though it was not among those artifacts that had been put on the National Register. They thought of this as the pathway to freedom. And rhetoric, I should mention, is really important in this kind of process, because rhetoric is almost a glue to driving a political consensus in a situation like this that is so emotionally fraught. And remember, this is taking place. This is 2002. This is taking place. It's not that many years after 9/11, and emotions are still very, very raw. So, as often is the case, preservation of the staircase was especially controversial. For preservationists, the stairs were very important. They argued that it was the last above-ground remnant of the World Trade Center, and it would have meaning for generations to come. To press their case, they petitioned the National Trust to put the stairs on the register. For developers and some neighborhood groups, they looked at this and they said, this is an eyesore. It doesn't remind us of anything. Actually, it does remind us of the 9/11 destruction, and we really don't want to be reminded that viscerally of that. And to boot, the destruction, this is an image here, the destruction was not due to 9/11. The destruction was due to the fact that when they were clearing the debris, the excavators destroyed some of the steps. So this fight for the preservation of these stairs went on for months and months and months. And finally, there was an agreement. And the agreement was that 38 of the steps would be removed. The survivors of the steps would be removed, separated from the concrete structure, okay, and moved and put in place in the museum. This is a mock-up of what it would look like in the 9/11 museum. This is the escalator that brings you down into the exhibit area, and these are the steps that are now aligned with the escalator, and they're there for preservation. And this allowed the steps were in the way of the building pad for one of the towers. So accommodating them in the museum was acceptable to the preservationists and the families and the survivors, and it allowed the Tower 2 to go forward in development. So again, it was a compromise in which you were dealing with this tension between rebuilding and remembrance that had to be accommodated. Now, there is actually a much bigger story about preservation, because mostly with preservation, you have the preservation of existing buildings. Here, the object of preservation was to preserve artifacts of destruction. It's sort of like counterintuitive to what preservation is typically about. There were many other accommodations and some conflicts for which no accommodation could be found. But I think these three examples give you a sense of what it means to have tension between two equally important objectives, but most of the time were in conflict with one another. These stories highlight really the three driving forces that shaped rebuilding the site: civic purpose, political opportunity, and commercial gain. And I want to, make my concluding remarks and focus on the political opportunity, because as I sat down to make sense out of this big story and all the people involved, it was essentially a story of politics in an era where you did not have a Robert Moses, where you didn't have a building czar who could determine singly what was going to happen. As I said in the opening remarks, rebuilding up represented a political opportunity for the governor, for the mayor. The governor was trying to run for the nomination, for the Republican nomination for president. So being able to have a platform like the rebuilding of Ground Zero was an opportunity for the governor, for the mayor, the families of the victims, such that the politics and symbolism of 9/11 drove decisions that in the normal course of events would have been determined by market-driven economics. But Ground Zero was anything but a typical real estate development project, although it was a development project. Ground Zero was the highest possible platform to advance ambition. Elected officials wanted a fast rebuilding process. Families wanted immortality for their lost ones. Silverstein and his investment partners wanted to rebuild the investment opportunity they had just lost. The Port Authority wanted to recreate its money machine. And they wanted a transportation center that would be their own memorial to their fallen. when I say there was a lot of friction among the diverse stakeholders, that's an absolute understatement. There's no other way to say it. There was great uncertainty that prevailed on the site over who was in control. And the problem was nobody was in control. Governor Pataki had most of the political power, but he wasn't really in full control. And there were no clear rules about how decisions were going to be made. So everything was a tussle, and everything was about resolving a conflict, and it went on for years. Everybody believes that, it's very interesting. There's a whole narrative that the press carried forward about rebuilding, that it was taking forever. I mean, as if this was a Lego set that you could just, stack the blocks up and rebuild fast. But in fact, this site was basically rebuilt in 15 years, which is an extraordinarily short period of time by New York standards. The redevelopment of Times Square took 20, 25. Battery Park City took 30. Nothing gets built, nothing of this scale gets built quickly in most cities. And especially given that this site was encumbered by so much trauma, I would say that it was rebuilt relatively quickly. It's about 75%, 80% rebuilt, and the rest will follow in the next 5 years or so. I'd like to conclude with two observations that emphasize why the story of Ground Zero holds meaning beyond New York. First, and most importantly, the experience at Ground Zero defined collective rights to symbolic territory. The whole world was watching, and the process and plan for rebuilding legitimized a new set of voices, claiming a right to influence what was being built on the site that was transformed by collective tragedy and sanctified by extraordinary loss. I don't recall any other situation where property rights were superseded temporarily by the collective voice of individuals and victims that had a stake in what was going to happen on this site. These rights were political. They were accorded to citizens first through a very elaborate planning process, participatory planning process, and then they were aggressively asserted by a vocal chorus of opposition to anything that threatened to overshadow the memory of those who perished. These political rights exerted enormous pressure on influence on the course of events, not just at the margins. The collective experience proved that Ground Zero did not just belong solely to those players whose property rights could be enforced in courts of law, but rather the site, in its most fundamental sense, belonged to the city and its residents, the nation and its citizens. That didn't happen at Oklahoma City when the federal building in Oklahoma City was bombed, but it did happen at Ground Zero because of the geopolitical significance and the scope of murder that happened on that site. The second conclusion I would want to make here is that the story of rebuilding reveals how economics, the full story, which, if you have the patience to read the book, reveals how economics interacted with politics in powerfully symbolic ways. It explains why large-scale projects take so long in American cities where dispersed political influence is the norm, where fragmented political power is the norm. And rebuilding Ground Zero, which by my calculations cost about $26 billion, presents a window on the power and politics of money in American cities today. So much of the discussion in the first 5-6 years was about design and about the vision and what should be built. Once the master plan was accepted, it became a story about the the power of money and how it would shape. Once the master plan was accepted and once the memorial design was accepted, so we're talking about 2007, once those decisions were settled, it became total story and conflict about money and where it was going to come from to rebuild, because about then they started to realize that they had to worry about the money. Before then, money was sort of too dirty to talk about in rebuilding this site of tragedy. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer whatever questions that you might have. This is what's on the site today. This is the iconic structure that was that is intended to replace the Twin Towers. This is one of the parapets surrounding one of the memorial pools, which has the name of everyone who passed away at Ground Zero in Washington, D.C., in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where one of the planes crashed, and also those who perished in the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. This is the oculus, the defining sculptural characteristic of the transportation center. This is part of the green surrounding, and these are the office buildings going up. So it is become a piece of the city.
So thank you very much, Lynne, for that. It's actually quite affecting account that you've given of the story of the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan. Who would like to ask the first question?
There's so much of the story that I didn't tell, so there must be questions.
Yeah. Danielle.
Hi. You implied that the one relatively straightforward thing was acquiring the extra couple of blocks below the main original footprint in order to get the 10 million square feet.
We can't quite hear.
Oh, do I need to press something?
No.
No. Can you hear me now? Is that better?
Better.
Okay. No, you implied the one straightforward thing was acquiring the additional site below the original footprint to be able to accommodate the full 10 million square feet of office space. Presumably it wasn't totally straightforward in that there would have been people displaced. I mean, was it sort of eminent domain and compulsory purchase, or how was that obtained?
I'm looking for that. I'm sorry, what was her question?
So the additional couple of blocks below the site so that they could get the full amount of office space that was acquired fairly straightforwardly. There didn't seem to be any dispute about getting that additional site to be built on.
Bit more on the story on how the extra acreage was acquired.
Oh, okay. How this extra acreage was acquired?
Yes, because you implied it was straightforward.
They actually, it was purchased from. There's a couple of streets were withdrawn from the city map, but This was the site of the former Deutsche Bank building, which was partially destroyed, and it was really a toxic site because there was so much asbestos and the whole place was toxic, But so this site was acquired by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation using some of the federal funds that were given to the city, and this was the former Deutsche Bank building. This site was owned by a private developer, and it was purchased from the developer. They did not have to use eminent domain. They did not have to use condemnation. There were some things that were not contentious, and they paid a fair price, if not a premium, for that. So that they didn't have to use eminent domain here. And it was fairly. This street still exists. Liberty Street still exists. Cedar Street exists. These still exist, but this doesn't. This doesn't.
Okay. Yes, Jess.
Shall I just shout?
Bring
Yes.
the microphone. Bring the microphone down, Chris, to here. Oh, it's coming. It's okay. You're all right.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed that. I just wanted to ask about your 180 interviewees, and could you say a little bit more about who they were and what, which proportion of those were, say, family members, and also a little bit about access, how you got access to them?
Yes, I was fortunate. I spoke with absolutely everybody who was involved, including Governor Pataki. I did not interview Michael Arad because he had been pissed off by other interviews, but he was very gracious in giving me images. And Santiago Calatrava, who also had gotten bad press by that, didn't want to talk to me, even though I had one of his sons as my student. But other than that, I interviewed everybody. And I was fortunate in that, having done the Times Square book, which was the other major project in New York City, I had a reputation for balance. And I had people who were players who vouched for my bona fides. And it's interesting that you asked that question, because I've talked to journalist schools about this, about how you do these kind of interviews. I did all of my interviews off the record, background only, and I did not use a tape recording machine. I have a method of doing this. I would think about the questions I wanted. I would send those questions ahead of time to the interviewer so they have a chance to think about them. And then they would either answer the questions that I would ask them, or sometimes they would just talk. And I would scribble notes as fast as possible. And I always did no more than 2 interviews a day. And I would immediately go back to my office or my computer and transcribe as best as I could. Then when it came, there were 2 things that made that process easy to manage. One was because I knew a lot of these people, and people knew of me, I said, it's off the record. I need to understand how the decisions were made so that I can interpret the primary documents, so that I can read between the lines of the documents. And they understood that. And I said, if I want to attribute anything to you, I'm going to come back and show you what the quote's going to be. And they were okay with that. And so that's the first thing that made it acceptable process. The second was, so much was in the public record. So many of these players had spoken on the record, and with search engines today, you could just find quotes that people had already made. So the combination of being able to get people to talk candidly, and people did talk candidly. And I started early enough. My first interviews were in 2003. And when I interviewed somebody later in the process, like in 2010, I knew that person was giving me a revisionist story. Okay? I mean, and a lot of times, all the time, I'm cross-checking what somebody said against the record, against what other people are saying to verify whether it was fact or whether it was opinion. I also had, in the master planning process, I had particular access because my husband was the urban designer on Liebeskin's team. And it was the only team in which they had an urban designer. And so I knew exactly what was going on in that particular phase of it. And in the latter phase, I mean, understanding finance, which I've always viewed as sort of a means to an end, and understanding the real estate decision-making process that developers use allowed me to interpret things. But there was the financial terms of the deals that made the towers possible, which they were heavily subsidized, except for the one that's not up yet because it's not subsidized. The financial terms were so complicated that I went to somebody to just check out that I really understood it well enough to write about it. And the response from that person, whose board I'm on, said, I've never seen anything so complicated in my life because of the conditions and the cost. I mean, these buildings, they're all this. The Freedom Tower is 2.4 million square feet, so what's that, 200, I can't get to meters. This is 1.6 million square feet. This is 2.3 million square feet. This one isn't built yet. There's another fascinating aspect. Because this is sacred territory, none of the infrastructure for the memorial could go on the site. And there had to be redundancy. So it's all under, and Calatrava didn't want anything in the path stations. So it's all in the first, underground in Tower 2. This was incredibly expensive to do because the original World Trade Center site there was a city underneath what you could see on grade. And the Port Authority made a critical unilateral decision before any discussion of the master plan that they were going to rebuild the total underground. Well, that's actually a determinate decision because nobody knew where the towers were going to go. Nobody knew where the columns were going to have to be put in. And there was a subway running down underground here. And Governor Pataki insisted that the subway could not be shut down. That caused an enormous complication technically and cost-wise because of the kind of excavation they had to do and the kind of bracing to keep that subway, which couldn't move within 1/16 of an inch of vibration. So, and that was a political decision because a good part of Pataki's constituency is down here in Staten Island. And they needed the #1 subway to go there. Now, the Port Authority and the MTA could have run buses, but no, they were not going to run buses. So there are just endless complications that all sort of swirl around money and politics once the memorial decisions were made.
Okay. And yes.
Thank you. You've tried to answer the question I was really going to ask, which is, the original site of the Twin Towers is now the memorial site, or largely. So, what has happened to the original investors' interest in the site?
What happened to the original investors' interest?
Who owns the development as it now is? Because it's obviously substantially bigger investment than what was there originally.
I'm going to go back to in July of 2001, Larry Silverstein and his investment partnership bought the leasehold interest for 99 years for all of this. And there was a retail underneath. When the towers fell, it was unclear. The leases said that he had to rebuild all of what was destroyed, whether there was insurance, sufficient insurance or not. And that's a whole other chapter, okay? And that was a huge amount of litigation. And Silverstein was actually forced by his lenders to insure the site for $3.2 billion. Or is it $3.5 billion? I've forgotten some of the numbers. And he made a claim that it was two occurrence event, 2 planes, 2 buildings. And so that litigation went on for a long time. And the bottom line of that litigation was he he walked away for rebuilding purposes for $4.75 billion, $4.765 billion, something like that. The Port Authority still owns the land, and Silverstein had the obligation to rebuild, and that was never challenged. Silverstein, at that point in time, did not have an organization with the capacity to rebuild this site, the commercial part of the site. Okay. He quickly developed that capacity, but he didn't have it then. And there were a number of points in time where there was a question of whether he should be bought out or condemned out using eminent domain. And the pragmatic decision was made that it would just tie up the site in litigation, and it would have for years. And remember, I said the politicians wanted things rebuilt as soon as possible. So Larry Silverstein and his investment partnership maintained the development rights and the obligation to rebuild. But by the time the underground was complete, by the time all the decisions were made, that $4.675 billion was down to about $2 billion, and that was not going to be enough. So what happened was in 2006, Mayor Bloomberg's running for a second term, and he calls the question that Silverstein does not have sufficient funds. Got really ugly. Okay? The bottom line of that episode was that this site and this site were taken away from Silverstein. That's the language he would have used. I would just say they were separated. And Silverstein got these three sites, the ground rent that he owed the Port Authority, which he'd been paying since July 2001, was prorated, and the Port Authority was going to do these two sites. Therefore, that reduced his obligation, pro rata. These were the most valuable sites. He got the better deal. The Port Authority wanted this because that was going to be the iconic, and this was the Port Authority's too. And you didn't know it was asked yet who's going to pay for the memorial. This memorial, the underground and the infrastructure the Port Authority paid for, but the actual memorial museum, this is not, believe it or not, and it's still hard for New York, this is not a government, this is not the national government, this is not run by the Park Service, which runs all the other memorials and parks in the United States. This is run by a private foundation, of which former Mayor Bloomberg has been the chairman since 2006 or 7. So, it's a real public-private site. That's a long answer to your question. There are very few short answers, but I'll try.
Okay, no, it's very comprehensive.
Just building on that one for a second, you mentioned in your presentation that the government put in 20 billion. The federal government put in 20 billion or...
20 billion.
20 billion. Did that
20 billion to New York City for rebuilding and recovery. So some of it went to actually clean up the site.
Was Silverstein compensated effectively as part of that to help subsidise the bill?
The victims?
Silverstein.
No. Silverstein. There are lots of there's a complexity here. First of all, the 20 billion does not include the compensation to the victims' families. That's a whole separate kind of thing. Nor does it include compensation and health benefits for first responders who got sick, many of whom died from the toxicity of the site. Okay, so the 20 billion that Bush promised was for recovering and rebuilding, and it included Liberty bonds and it included lots of different things. Silverstein did not get any compensation. Okay, he had the insurance. He was obligated to rebuild based upon his purchase of that site. That's the rights to that site, when it was still whole, went for $3.2 billion, which was sort of a landmark sum at that point in time. Silverstein did, however, I mean, there was a whole question of, was he liable? What kind of liability did Silverstein and the partnership, and it was a partnership with other investors, what kind of liability did they face for 9/11? Did they have sufficient security? Because it was their site at that point. Not the Port Authority just owned the land, but they weren't managing it. And Silverstein started to spend the insurance money for lots of reasons. One, a lot of lobbying in D.C. so he would not have to face the liability that either the airlines would sue him or that families would sue him. And they succeeded in eliminating that liability. That was a big win, okay? Because there was the question of who was liable for security on the site. I mean, it's also amazing that this was the second attack on the site. The ground lease made no provision for what would happen if the site was totally destroyed. Nobody conceived, the lawyers, nobody conceived of the possibility that, one, there could be a second attack, which was totally light, there was some positive probability of that. But nobody conceived of that it could be totally destroyed. Because had they done that, the leases would have been written differently, because it's unclear whether Silverstein would have been able to retain the development rights, the redevelopment rights, because he was obligated by those leases to rebuild exactly what was in place or what the Port Authority agreed to. But now the Port Authority wasn't the decider here, because this had become a sacred site and it had become a collective decision managed by the leading politicians.
Okay. We probably have time for maybe one more question. There's a hand up at the back, Steph. Steph?
Shout.
Oh, I'm okay. I'm fine. I don't need a microphone. I'm having a hard time working out how it's commercially viable moving forward to be able to serve the ground leases, because of the fact that, and I don't know anything about the specifics, but just looking at it, the size of the replacement buildings relative to those that were originally there, the occupancy seems to be less. Therefore, and also tenants that had originally been there resettled in other places like Jersey City. So again, not knowing the numbers, it just seems to me that there is a risk that perhaps how much they could get for renting out the new buildings may not be sufficient to be able to meet the ground rent, because just the square footage which is occupied by rentable buildings is less.
Well, one, they actually will probably, measuring square footage in New York is an art form. I mean, it really is. There's gross, there's net, there's, but they will have rebuilt 10 million square feet, really 10.5 million square feet. This is not an economic venture. This building, by the Port Authority's accounting, which may not include their staff time, was $4 billion. The most expensive tower in the world. It's more expensive than the Burj. Okay? So it's unclear whether this will ever pay for itself. These two towers are incredibly heavily subsidized. This is totally subsidized by New York City, New York State, and the Port Authority. The Port Authority has its new headquarters here. This building is partially subsidized. This building is supposed to be market-driven, which is why we don't have there's no tenant there yet. So, I haven't run the numbers, but when you ask the question about rents in Lower Manhattan, first of all, it's interesting. These buildings were all sort of designed for financial services. Financial services have almost all moved to Midtown, okay? So what's here now? Interestingly enough, tech and media has come here. Condé Nast moved here. They were a big, important player because the rents were less expensive. The rents were affordable, and media companies are hard-pressed to survive. So they were going where the rents would be less expensive. As a historical rule in real estate in New York, in Manhattan, Lower Manhattan has always been at a discount to Midtown. When Midtown gets very expensive, firms start to gravitate to Lower Manhattan because the gap is sufficient enough that it becomes an attractive buy. Given how these were subsidized, and there's a page in my book that lists all the subsidies, incredibly subsidized. So, you know, when the rents increase to market, Silverstein's and the investor partnership is doing, I would imagine they're doing well. I don't know the numbers. But it's a very nice environment. You have this memorial, which is gorgeous. And basically, you know, each footprint is an acre. So you have a 6-acre park. That's like unheard of in Lower Manhattan, to have 6 acres of greenery, beautifully designed. So it's the amenity of the site, which is now integrated into the fabric of the city, it's become quite a nice place. And the transportation is superb. So, you know, nobody, after 9/11, there was, you know, doom and gloom, and nobody thought anybody would ever go into towers again. That changed relatively quickly. So this building is not quite full. Tower 1 isn't quite full, and they've had 2 or 3 failures to get an anchor tenant here. It's tough, but you know, it'll eventually happen.
Okay. I'm going to draw proceedings to a close there. Can I end by thanking Lynne very much for that presentation. I strongly recommend the book. Among the many reviews that it's had, the word that is most common among them is authoritative. This is the definitive history of the rebuilding of Lower Manhattan. It's an epic book about an epic event and an epic activity. And it's in the tradition of those great epic books about New York, like Robert Caro's biography of Robert Moses. So I strongly recommend you to read it. Lots of food for thought, not all of which we've been able to explore in these questions, but there's a chance to continue the conversation now in the South Cloisters, where all things being equal, there should be some wine and things for you to eat. So if you haven't had a chance to ask a question, but still have things to discuss with Lynne, please do join us. But before we do that, could we thank her in the traditional way?